your upcoming book, tentatively titled Traumatized, and now we have a semicolon, which I did not remember.
The gentrification of suffering and the death of liberalism.
Very cool. You talk about trauma being decontextualized. Now, granted, I have not read this. Rather, I've listened to an address that you gave in Georgetown, which we can link below because I think it's really fascinating address. But you cite the example of Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, where she talks about the trauma experienced by Chilean political prisoners under Pinochet without acknowledging the US-led anti-communist campaign that instigated it. Can you expand on the implications of this further? Because I found that really fascinating.
So Herman was talking about this technique to help people recover from trauma called flooding, where you relive the trauma with a therapist, where you write down what you've experienced, or sometimes you reenact even like scenes of childhood abuse and everything. Because you're in a safe environment and you repeat the experience, you can overcome it. And it was pioneered in the Veterans Administration for soldiers suffering from PTSD. And then Herman very casually says that a lot of this technique was first used by these Chilean psychiatrists and psychoanalysts for people who had survived Pinochet's torture cells and who were leftists who had been persecuted by him. And so I went and actually read through the accounts of the clinical account written by Ana Julia Cienfuegos and Cristina Minelli. And the amazing thing about what they did was Pinochet had not been brought to power. You know, he had fallen from power. And in the aftermath of this, they thought, or actually Pinochet was still in power. They were doing this in the underground for a while, and then they made it more official. They treated victims in such a way that they could take down their testimony and sort of put the Pinochet regime on trial in a clinical setting. Like, this happened to you because you were working with Salvador Allende, you opposed American imperialism. Pinochet grabs you from the street and tortures you, imprisons you. And it was to create a political, social context for people who were completely broken, but not broken just individually and physically. The psychoanalysts and psychiatrists were emphasizing that these young people lost hope for the future. And so they taped their testimonies and they would stage these mock trials of the torturers, of the victimizers, hoping to restore a sense of agency and heal these victims of Pinochet's regime. Cienfuegos and Minelli were very modest about what they thought could happen, but they said this is a really important documentation of the testimony of the victims of Chile's military dictatorship, right? None of this is in the Herman book. And in the last chapter, she's actually very supportive of NATO and US bombing of Yugoslavia and the breakup of Yugoslavia because there's all these human rights violations. So it was really like striking to me that you have people who are a victim of US imperial policy, foreign policy. Absolutely no clear victimization. And the US medical establishment and the feminists are extracting this technique and this wisdom from a nation. I mean, we can use global south. I like to use the third world, but they victimize you and then they extract your technique of healing, your therapies that you've actually pioneered in order to restore political agency to the victims of your foreign policy. And you're decontextualizing it and bringing it back to saying this can heal American victims of trauma in the rape clinics, where she was seeing a lot, treating a lot, many people women who were also in their own context. I mean, I don't think I can unseal any of this records, but it's very clear that many of them came from blue collar, working class Irish families near Harvard, Cambridge, from this town of Somerville, where she was treating a lot of these women. So you have all of these kinds of depoliticizing movements, these really politically naive apprehensions of both the therapeutic technique and the narratives of recovery. Like, she doesn't ever say, like, Well, why were these people being tortured? Or what role did America have to play in this? America had to play a huge role in this. So it just seemed to me like this kind of political naivete about trauma and recovery was extracting something once again from the global South. And the whole thing about America's fear of communism drove it to support the most murderous regimes. I mean, we're not even talking about Indonesia. I mean, I don't think, that whole thing, the trauma of Indonesia should be front and center in any discourse about foreign policy and trauma. But if you look at the literature on trauma, communist victims of American imperialism never figure as important agents of any of these trauma narratives. So I just think that it fits in well with the Cold War attitude about American superiority. Because one of the other moral superiority, because the other aspect of the trauma narrative in the 80s and 90s was that as the Berlin Wall was falling, as Eastern Europe was being integrated into the global capitalist network, a lot of the rhetoric around NGOs and around the reintegration of these former communist countries was that they did not deal with the Holocaust. We did. They didn't reckon with the European past. So we have better psychological tools to deal with trauma. They're in denial and to be integrated into Western Europe and the global capitalist flows, they have to acknowledge that they are behind in terms of dealing with this horrific thing that happened in Europe in World War II. And that gives the sort of professional managerial class executors of the terms of the end of the Cold War a kind of moral superiority as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting too, because I think it's so much of a part of our Western culture now to use psychological terms somewhat inaccurately, but it's just so widespread. And to have this idea of,
Not only inaccurately, but to take our culture of therapy and just impose it upon other cultures, other places. There are certain universal principles about the psyche. I'm deeply invested in psychoanalysis that I think are absolutely necessary to look at. But one of the things about trauma, from any point of view, is that it is embedded in a culture, and each culture deals with suffering in its own way. But one of the things that the United States and Britain follows along with is imposing a narrative of recovery from that. So I call that the trauma script. And you impose the trauma script as a healer or an imperialist, a professional. And that is just not very good therapy either, but it is definitely American foreign policy. Like, you guys suffered, this is how you're going to recover. And we have the best techniques, we have the best drugs. In Ethan Waters' Crazy Like Us, he said that a lot of the USAID packages that go into post-crisis places like Indonesia, Thailand during the post-tsunami earthquake world was feminine hygiene. You get a package of feminine hygiene and antidepressants and psychotropic drugs.